Well, it's my pleasure to introduce Sue Aboul-Hosn. I hope I said that right.
Aboul-Hosn, thank you.
Okay, and she works for the Department of Children and Families Regional Human Traffic Coordinator for the Central and Suncoast Regions. And so since I've actually been trying for like a year to get a presentation on human trafficking. And so I'm very excited to hear what Sue has to say. And so I'm just going to introduce her and let her take it from there.
Okay, thank you, Elaine. I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully everyone can see it. Let's see, where are we? Okay, is it up for you?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, so hopefully we're going to learn about human trafficking. I have it kind of timed out to be for 2 hours, but we might finish a little early, depending. I do have a lot of videos throughout the training because I think in a video, watching a 3-minute video, you can learn much more than me speaking for an hour. So we have quite a few of those as well. So we'll get started. Based on what you were asked for, we're going to talk about human trafficking, define it, sex and labor, the scope of the problem, the myths and the realities, talk about the trafficker and the power and control tactics that the trafficker uses, and what are the vulnerabilities of the victims and the mindset of the victims. And we're going to talk about trauma bonding as well. And then the appropriate response, the collaboration needed, and the clinical interventions that are happening. So I hope those covers what you asked for. I obviously work for children, so I talk a lot more from a child, not from a child's perspective, but on child statistics and child data. But all of our children grow up and become adults, and a lot of it becomes the same. And obviously, I've worked with some adults between 18 and 21 as well. So if I revert back and say child a lot, that's because I'm usually training and talking to social workers and clinical people and case management that works with children. So obviously we know it's a worldwide problem, right? The United Nations Office of Drugs and Crime, this is from their website, and just showing you how there's sexual exploitation, begging and other forms and forced labor throughout the world. And you can see the color of the people everywhere. People don't realize that actually the United States is one of the prime destinations for sexual exploitation. Everyone thinks it's third world countries, but we actually have quite a bit in the United States itself. And labor trafficking, we're going to talk about that as well. So right here is a video which talks about all types of human trafficking, the different phases of human trafficking. And this was made here by the Blue Campaign, which is the Homeland Security campaign against trafficking.
My trafficker was my husband. There was no way I could reach out to anybody for help.
We're scared. We're scared to run. We're scared to tell anybody what's going on.
It was an incredibly violent situation. I felt like there was no way I could get out.
Human traffickers can be just about anyone from any walk of life. A lot of the trafficking involves domestic servitude, hoteliers, restaurant owners, owners of massage parlors, agricultural farm owners.
It can be a trafficker who tells a woman, I want to be your boyfriend, I love you, and if you love me, you're going to go out and have sex for money. It can be kind of psychological like that, or it can be more overt, more physical. It can be hitting, abusing, keeping them away from any support systems.
Trafficking, it doesn't know any boundaries. The victim can be male, female, transgendered, anyone. And it happens all over America.
I still see this attitude of it's just immigrants or it's just people in other countries. It happens to U.S. citizens so much more than people are aware.
The natural stakeholders in this issue are certainly law enforcement, legal advocates, social service providers. There's other players involved as well.
It is important to engage the community because victims often don't self-identify. They don't come forward to law enforcement.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Citizens in the community are the eyes and the ears.
It's medical workers, it's educators, it's personnel at homeless shelters.
We can't do this alone. No one has the capacity to provide every single thing that a victim or survivor of human trafficking needs.
There has to be a support system within the community, psychological counseling, shelter, and vocational education so they can reintegrate, become a healthy individual.
There's an intentional effort to get everyone together so we know how to share resources, we know how to work together, and to make sure at the end of the day, a victim becomes a survivor.
Okay, so hopefully so was everyone able to hear that, I hope?
That would be a yes.
Okay,
Yes,
thank you.
We're all nodding.
Like,
We
forgot you
could
could-
our heads and she can't see us.
Yeah, I know. I can't see anybody. So, and that's the only thing I don't like about Zoom is that when you're presenting, you don't get to see people. Okay, so that was an introduction to human trafficking. You heard from different survivors and prosecutors and different people, advocates. So what is the definition? What is human trafficking? So for sex trafficking, it's recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, obtaining, patronizing, or soliciting of a person for the purpose of a commercial sex act in which the commercial sex act is induced by force, fraud, or coercion. We often hear those words with human trafficking, force, fraud, or coercion. But I want to remind you that for a child under the age of 18, none of those elements need to be present. You do not need force, fraud, or coercion for a child under the age of 18 for sex trafficking. That's in the federal law and in the state law. Because a child cannot consent to sex in the first place. So it just goes out the door. You don't need to prove those elements. If someone is exploiting a child for their benefit, for financial gain, it's sex trafficking. A commercial sex act means any sex act on account of which anything of value is given to or received by any person. And it doesn't have to be money. It could be something else. It could be drugs. It could be a place to live. It could be, different things. We'll talk more about that. Labor trafficking, recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for labor or services using force, fraud, or coercion. So in the federal definition, we do have force, fraud, and coercion for labor trafficking for minors and adults. However, in the state of Florida, a couple years ago, they took out coercion for minor labor trafficking, which really isn't that significant because there's never been a case prosecuted on the state level for minor labor trafficking. They've always been a federal, in the federal courts. And I want to point out there is a difference between trafficking and smuggling. Those who don't work in the field that much don't realize it. They think smuggling and trafficking is the same thing, but you need to remember that trafficking is a crime against a person and smuggling is a crime against a country. It's two different crimes. It doesn't mean that someone who's smuggled into a country doesn't end up being trafficked, because that often does happen. They think they're coming for one reason, they're really coming to be trafficked. They willingly come, they agree to come, they want to be smuggled into the country, but then it's not what they thought it was. So smuggling and trafficking is not the same thing. They're separate crimes, they often intersect, but remember with trafficking, you do not have to have movement. You can have someone in the villages traffic and never left, as the villages in Lake County or Marion County, whatever the county is, that they don't have to move. So let's talk about the scope of the problem. So there's three sources of data that we see often. We see DCF, we have our own data. And then the Center for Missing and Exploited Children has data too. Then the Polaris Project, and the Polaris is the National Human Trafficking Hotline. I can't see you guys to ask if you're familiar with any of these, but we're going to talk about them. And you often see all this data out there and you'll read reports, but remember, it's based on the source of that data. So our data is going to be, we're going to have data on children that's been reported to our abuse hotline at DCF. It's not going to cover every child in Florida. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children are going to have data on children who are reported missing to them. Not every child is reported missing to the National Center of Missing and Exploited Children. And Polaris Project also releases a lot of data on reports that are called into their hotline. So with what's called into the hotline, they don't even know once it's investigated if it's confirmed or not. They just know someone called in a tip, they report it back to the area, to the local law enforcement in Florida. If it's a minor, they report it back to DCF. So, it all depends. You have to understand where the data is coming from. Then the International Labor Organization estimates that there's 40 million victims of human trafficking globally. This is worldwide. And 68% are trapped in forced labor. 25% of all victims are children, and 71% of all victims are women and children. And this is International Labor Organization from the reports they received. So going back to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, NCMEC, I don't know if everyone's familiar with NCMEC. It's a great organization. They have a lot of counselors up there. They're actually, their main headquarters is in Alexandria, Virginia, but they have a location down in Florida near Fort Lauderdale, and they have one in Texas that I'm aware of too. And so here with DCF back in 2003, we had an agreement with them. Every child that goes missing from foster care, we reported it to them. And so they help look for those children through their data systems and through their, different resources that they had, which is great, a great partner. But not every law enforcement in Florida reported the missing child to the National Center. So the majority were more foster care children that were reported to them initially. In 2019, they report that 23,500 endangered runaways that they received reports on, 1 in 6 were likely to become victims of child sex trafficking. And so today, the average age of child sex trafficking victims who are reported missing is 15 years old. And child sex trafficking has been reported in all 50 states. Again, that's based on the data that's been reported to them. And I want to stress that because a lot of our community children and non-foster care children are not being recognized as much as they should be or identified because they don't have all these other sources that they're being reported to, et cetera. When I get to DCF numbers, I'll talk more about the community children. So again, these are statistics you will see everywhere. If you Google things on the internet, the International Labor Organization estimates forced labor and human trafficking to be a $150 billion industry worldwide. There's no official rate for the total number of human trafficking victims in the US. We know that because we don't know what we don't know. 1 in 3 teens will be approached for recruitment by a pimp within 48 hours of leaving home and becoming homeless. So again, if a child runs away to the streets, not to someone they know, not to a friend's house, because that's a different group, they're going to be recruited on the streets because they need shelter, they need food, and that trafficker is going to recognize that vulnerability and is going to approach them. The average age of entry into the commercial sex industry in the United States from the data we've collected is between 12 and 14 years old, or you could say 13. And then Polaris estimates the total number of victims in the United States reaches into the hundreds of thousands. So now we'll get to specific Florida. Again, from the Polaris reports, people calling into the national hotline, Florida ranks number 3 with reports called to the hotline. California is number 1, Texas number 2, and Florida is number 3. But again, you have to think about also the population of those states, right? So they have the top number of reports, but again, those are some of the higher populated states in the country as well. And the Polaris, again, the national hotline provided this map here. And these were reports made to that hotline between January and June of 2019. So that's for a 6-month period, just showing you in Florida where the majority comes, which obviously are, we have Miami-Dade, Orange County, of course, Circuit 20, if you can see that where Lee County is, Immokalee is, Collier County. We have a lot more labor trafficking cases in that area called in, even to the DCF hotline than other areas, and Hillsborough County. So you can kind of see more of the heavy populated, dense areas that we are getting those reports called into. So here's DCF's numbers. Back in 2009, DCF actually added the maltreatment to DCF's abuse hotline. I assume everyone on this call knows about DCF's abuse hotline. If you suspect a child's being abused or neglected by the caregiver responsible, you make a report to the abuse hotline. But for human trafficking, which is unique from all the other maltreatments at our hotline, we accept reports for human trafficking regardless who the alleged perpetrator may be. So you can suspect the child's trafficking him or herself for survival. You can suspect that there's a third party, there's an actual trafficker, there's a pimp that's trafficking that child. Or it could be a family member and a parent or caregiver as well. So for human trafficking only at our abuse hotline, we accept reports on all aspects of whoever the perpetrator may be. It could be an unknown perpetrator. You don't have to know the perpetrator for human trafficking. So it's a bit different from all the other maltreatments. So in 2009, when we added that maltreatment, it was like in May, we only received 43 reports statewide. So it took a while to educate the community. It's not that in 2009 we had less cases than we had last year. It's always been here. It's a growing problem too with internet. We'll talk about that later. But awareness to our people who are common reporters, law enforcement, schools, medical providers, had to become more aware that they can make a report to the hotline for a child suspected of human trafficking, regardless if it's the parent caregiver or not. So it's a little bit different. But you can see in 2019, 1,685 initial unique IDs. So these are unique children, individual children were reported to the hotline. And here I'm breaking it down. So initial reports were 1,962. The unique identifiers were 1,689. So those who have ever made a report to the hotline or worked with this population, you know that sometimes multiple reports are called on the same child. And that's why you get a difference between unique ID and initial reports. So 1,689 children were brought to the attention of the hotline, but over 1,962 reports for them. So to put it in more perspective, and I'm probably talking too fast, but let me know. You guys can interrupt me anytime. Like I said, I can't see your faces, so I don't know what's going on behind my screen, but just let me know. So 462 were verified. So you can say roughly 25% are verified. And then on the other side, and that stands for not substantiated. So at DCF, we have 3 codes. We have verified, we have not substantiated, and we have no indicators. So verified, obviously 100% verified. Not substantiated is that definitely something's going on, but there wasn't a preponderance of evidence to mark it verified, but it means that child still needs a service response. Something's going on. So again, the 462 and the 506, all of them should have had a service response plan based on the information gathered. From those total reports, the majority, as you can see, is CSEC, and CSEC stands for Commercial Sexual Exploitation of a Child. So sex trafficking of a minor. So 1,809 were for CSEC, while only 153 were for labor. So we know for minor children in the state of Florida, labor is not being recognized as much as it should. We're trying to do more awareness about child labor. And then again, males are underreported as well. 301 were males compared to 1,643 females. So kind of just giving you a breakdown of what it looks like from the reports we've received. And if you want to look up your county, for 2019, I haven't calculated 2020s yet because we have to wait till March every year to calculate because some reports can stay open up to 90 days. So end of December would just be closing now. So I believe Villages is Lake County. So that would be 38 received. Only 6 of those were verified, 8 not substantiated, and 24 no indicators. So among children, you had at least 14 children that needed to have a service plan response. So you can see there our highest intake for this area for what we call the Central Region is Orange County. 139 with 46 of those verified. And then the next one is Polk County, as you can see there. Of course, COVID has made an effect to the reports we receive at our hotline. In 2019, we had 1,959 initials. 2020, the total reports were 1,469. So we're down 25% roughly. Not sure how it's going to look this year, although January has been a relatively busy month and February for reports. So it might go back or even go up. You know, if people aren't seeing things, they're not reporting it. we've had a huge intake on social media related reports. But again, when people aren't seeing things, they're not reporting it. So we know that awareness leads to better identification, just like everyone on this call today, hopefully will leave knowing more and recognize more. So we do a lot of training. We do it for all responders, our child welfare, law enforcement, medical personnel, school personnel, hospitals. I was actually just contacted recently, and I'm helping Frontier Airlines do a training for all their staff. So everyone's getting trained, which is great. It creates more awareness. And then, how to screen the person if they're victims of trafficking. Again, here I have children because I'm pulling these screens from some of my other trainings. But there are several screening tools for adults and minors. The one we use in Florida, we created ourselves with several agencies, the Department of Juvenile Justice, law enforcement, FBI was involved. We were all involved, and we created our own screening tool because we wanted to include labor and sex trafficking, and we wanted to include males and females. So initially, when all these screening tools came out, they're really targeting females and for sex trafficking. And I think that's why we're seeing less reports on labor trafficking than we know exist. But our screening tool does cover both of that.
I have a quick question. Can I
Sure.
ask a question?
Yes.
So just going with that, are you also taking working or educating the LGBT community as well in the sense of gender identification or?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So I don't know if you're familiar with the Zebra Coalition, but that's the main LGBTQ service provider in Central Region. They're actually in Winter Park, but they also do a lot of video and other things like that. And we definitely partner with them, and they do a lot of awareness and work as well. And I'm gonna talk a little bit more about that too. So you heard their national labor organization, everyone reports how much money it makes. Obviously, if you can sell the same person over and over and over, you're making a lot of money. When you're working in organized crime, such as drugs and arms, you sell it, right? And you have to reinvest in more arms to sell again to make some more profit. And drugs, the same thing. You have to invest in more drugs to sell. So the most lucrative industry in the organized crime is human trafficking. And it's becoming more and more, I guess, prevalent among gangs and people who were used to doing more of the arms trafficking, drug trafficking, has now added human trafficking to what they do. So we've seen a big spike in gang trafficking as well. But again, it's a very lucrative industry. We know that. So there are different forms of modern day slavery, right? You can call it modern day slavery, you can call it human trafficking, but exploiting a person for someone else's benefit is what it is. And you'll find it in recreational facilities, healthcare, forestry and logging, carnivals, remote interactive sexual acts, factories, manufacturing, commercial cleaning services, arts and entertainment. All of these are the different forms and avenues for human trafficking. And I took this off of Polaris Project's website. And there's more, of course, illicit activities, landscaping, hotels and hospitality, construction, health and beauty services, personal sexual servitude, agricultural, animal husbandry, peddling, begging, restaurants and food service, traveling sales crews, pornography, bars, strips, clubs, and cantinas, domestic work, residential. There's outdoor solicitation, illicit massage, health and beauty. So there's all forms from all types of venues. So let's talk a little bit about the myths and facts about human trafficking, right? Going to watch this, hopefully watch this video about the perception of human trafficking. I think this really hits the point. Let's see if I can play this. Maybe I have to go, I think I have to go here. Is this showing on your screen or not, the video? I think I have to share it.
No, just a blank screen.
So I am going to
screen.
share this screen. I'm going to stop sharing that one. And then I'm going to share the one with the video on it. Let's see, where is it? It's right here. I'm going to go ahead and open it up. Now, do you see it?
Yes, we do.
Yes.
Okay.
Amsterdam,
South America,
Vietnam,
Thailand,
China,
Mexico. I would say primarily outside the US.
American children are bought and sold in prostitution here in the United States. It doesn't just happen in other countries.
I think of the criminal act of capturing people.
And they get drugged and put in vans.
They're kidnapped. Fake advertisements for, models, that kind of thing. And then they just are intimidated or beaten and taken away, I guess.
American kids from all different backgrounds have been and can be victimized in prostitution, although frequently they are kids who are from a foster care background, who have abuse and neglect in their family history, or are runaway and homeless children living on the street. These are kids who it is really easy for pimps and traffickers to recruit and force into prostitution.
mostly girls.
Little girls that are taken in vans from other countries.
Generally underprivileged women.
Boys are sexually exploited too in the United States, perhaps in the same percentages that girls are exploited. We need more research on the subject, but the bottom line is that boys are sex trafficked in the U.S. too. For over 20 years, ECPET USA has been working to make sure that no child is bought and sold and used for sex, because it happens here too. Please visit our website, ecpetusa.org, and find out how you can join us in the fight to end child sex trafficking.
Okay, let me go back and show the other. Oh.
Help. I think this is such a tough.
Sorry, I thought you guys were talking for a minute there.
We can see it now.
Okay, I'm going to get back to my put on the PowerPoint. Okay. Okay, we're back to the regular screen. Okay, so I think that just kind of shows you how people think of human trafficking. They don't realize that it's our own kids in our own schools and adults as well, young adults particularly, who are involved in this locally here. And we're going to talk more about their vulnerabilities. Okay, so, and of course the imagery and what we see on TV and the media doesn't help, right? It's not going to be a person chained up usually. It's very rare. Or tied up. You always see that. These kids usually are involved, particularly children, are involved voluntarily. I mean, the movie Taken was great. I watched it. It was a great movie. But, you know, let's be honest here. Not everyone, hardly anyone has a father like Liam Neeson. And it's not really what happens. I mean, in all those 1,600 and some reports on different kids we had last year, there was not one that was an abduction. You know, so it's not, I'm not going to say it never happens. It has happened. But that's not the common way that these kids and even, you know, young adults are recruited into this. We're going to hear from some other adults in a video coming up. So myths, all human trafficking involves commercial sex. Only undocumented foreign nationals get trafficked in the United States. All of these are obviously in red, so those are not true. Human trafficking only happens in illegal or underground industries. Only women and girls can be victims and survivors of sex trafficking. People being trafficked are physically unable to leave their situations, locked in, held against their will. Traffickers only target victims they don't know. So the International Labor Organization reports that 16 million people are exploited in the private sector, such as domestic work, construction, and agriculture. Based on recent studies conducted by Polaris, the National Abuse Hotline, the National Human Trafficking Hotline, there are many legal U.S. citizens that have been trafficked. And I would tell you from our reports, in those 450 some verified reports last year, there was not even 5% that were non-documented children. All of those were U.S. citizens. Human trafficking can happen in industries such as restaurants, cleaning services, construction, and factories. One study estimates that as many as half of sex trafficking victims and survivors are male. We know there's a lot of males. We don't really identify them as often. We have had some, but we know that it's an issue as well. Even though that may be the case for some circumstances, the real trafficking situations are more complicated. Oh, again, talking about being abducted or held against their will. Many survivors have been trafficked by romantic partners, including spouses, and by family members, including parents. So it's not someone they don't know. So we're going to talk a little bit about sex trafficking, then we'll go to labor trafficking as well. Again, we already gave the definition for sex trafficking, and note that forced fraud or coercion does not need to be present for minors under 18. It is present for adults, but not for minors. Different forms of sex trafficking. It could be a third party, a trafficker, a pimp, who's brokering the exchange of the sexual acts for something tangible, typically money. Pimps can be of any age, any gender, and any background. There's gang trafficking. We talked a little bit about that. The trafficking is a source of generating money for the gang, and the gang members involved in the trafficking of the victim. Then there's familiar or family-controlled trafficking, and this occurs when a family member or guardian sells the minor for a sex act. And then there's survival sex trafficking. We see a lot of this with our homeless population, a type of sex trafficking that does not involve a third party, where commercial sex acts are exchanged for basic needs, including food, shelter, or safety, to support a drug addiction, for a place to live, or for food, are the common ones. So the different types of sex trafficking can be street-based exploitation. There used to be a lot more of that known areas for prostitution, and there's still a lot of known areas, but we do know that the internet has really taken over quite a bit of that. Hotel, motel-based exploitation. There's always some hotels or motels who are more known for it happening there. Pornography, stripping, erotic nude massages. I don't know if you guys remember the huge things down in Jupiter, Florida, was a big case a couple years ago. Escort services, usually advertising on the online websites. It says escort services, but which really means prostitution. Phone sex lines, private parties, gang and organized crime-based exploitation, familiar exploitation, sex tourism, and forms of internet-based exploitation. So here's some examples of minor sex trafficking, type of reports we have received. Obviously, a minor trading a sex act with an adult in exchange for a place to sleep. Again, remember the whole survival. A pimp prostituting out an adolescent is what we typically think of when you're thinking of human trafficking of minors, but that's not always the common form. A father trading his underage daughter for drugs, exchanging something of value for a sex act. A mother allowing her landlord to have sex with her child as rent payment. A nightclub owner providing shelter and food for minors in exchange for exotic dancing. So I'll talk a little bit about the male victims. Let's see if this is going, oh good, this will play without me changing over. So this is a great documentary. It's an hour documentary. We're not showing the documentary now. This is just a trailer for it. But if you ever have the opportunity, you want to learn more about males, it's a great documentary about male trafficking, sex trafficking.
The very idea of discussing and letting anybody know that you were a victim of anything, let alone sexual violence, is an impossibility.
If we normalize that this crime is girls and women, we're excluding a huge part of the population. And in my opinion, we're not actually going to be able to seriously address the crime until we can properly talk about it. We're just not there yet.
People will look at, again, that it's a choice that a man makes, and so they don't understand the whole idea of trafficking and how you could be trafficked.
Throughout this whole time, like, I haven't really been doing anything to heal from this. I've just been trying to forget about it. I don't know, I'm so broken.
Again, if you have an opportunity to watch that documentary, it's really good. So the male victimization and what we've seen with the minors that we've actually had reports on, it's different dynamics a little bit, right? Ages 11 to 14 are usually being exploited by a third party, but the older male teenager, 15 to 19, is typically working independently, and the street term for that is renegades. They're trying to survival. It could be for drugs. It could be LGBTQ community. A lot of that, a child feels not welcomed at home, kicked out of home, etc. So has to survive and becomes victimized as well. They're referred to as rent boys, house boys, or chickens. And many years ago, when I first started researching a lot more on this, I just Googled rent boys, house boys, and a whole website came up. You could register, get online, and once you create an account, you could kind of just what you say you want a male, a certain size, color eyes, color hair. I mean, really disgusting. And it would be delivered to you wherever you were at. So it is underground a lot more, but it's definitely there. There's been research on commercial sexploitation, and like the lady said in the video from EPCAT, the research estimates that as many as 50% of all CSEC in the US are boys. Again, CSEC, and I should have done a screen on that, commercial sexual exploitation of a child is what it stands for, meaning sex trafficking. And there is a shortage of services for males. And I will say in Florida, we have the only male safe house in the whole United States here in Florida for victims. Youth that identify as gay or transgender are disproportionately represented among male CSEC victims, but not the majority of male victims. They're often sold in male-specific venues, like I said, rentboy.com, houseboys.com. Young men and boys may be less likely to have a third-party trafficker, may be engaging in transactional sex to meet their basic needs, and they're largely recruited more by their peers. That was what the research showed there. So issues with identifying commercial sex exploited boys, and you probably heard a little bit of this in that trailer, the unwillingness of boys to self-identify as sexually exploited due to shame and stigma about being gay or being perceived as gay by family or community, a lack of screening and intake by law enforcement and social service agencies rooted in the belief that boys are not victims, limited outreach by anti-trafficking organizations to the areas, venues, and tracts known for male prostitution, an oversimplification of the reality that boys are not generally pimped, which hides the needs and misinforms potential services. And males are seen as having more of a choice than females. So we're going to move on to labor trafficking. Any questions about that before we move on?
No hands raised, Sue.
Okay, let's go on. So we identified labor trafficking earlier on, but I'll repeat it again. The recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or solicitation, enticement, maintaining or obtaining of a child for labor or services for the purpose of subjecting that person to child labor, involuntary servitude, peonage, where someone is held against his or her will to pay off a debt bondage, or slavery. Again, in the state of Florida only, they removed the term coercion. Coercion is not required to be present in labor trafficking cases involving children under 18. So these are the different forms of labor trafficking: domestic servitude, forced labor, debt bondage, indentured or involuntary servitude, child labor, slavery. And the common venues we see this in is agriculture, hospitality and restaurants, commercial cleaning, salons, construction, landscaping, domestic work, door-to-door sales, factories, peddling, and begging. I want to talk a little bit about the difference between our documented, undocumented, and our domestic victim, right? The similarities are that they both have psychological abuses, beatings, birding, sexual abuse and starvation, isolation, drug and alcohol dependency. But the difference is with the non-documented is there's threats of deportation, there's threats against the victim's family members, there's withholding of documents, there's usually a debt, especially if they've been smuggled. But you don't see as much branding or tattoos. We'll talk a little bit more about branding and tattoos later. I just wanted to share this. This was several years ago. Oh, actually 2010. This was actually a newspaper article. So this was a labor trafficking case. And back in 2000, I forgot, it might have been 2011, I was at an event and a victim from this case actually spoke. And this was a case where this couple, they were US citizens, but they were from Filipino background, dual citizens, I guess. They created a staffing company and they got a contract with this very famous, exclusive, deluxe Boca Raton Golf Club Resort. And they went to the Philippines to recruit staff. And they had the right kind of visas, or, work visas, to bring the staff over. So as they recruited staff in the Philippines, each person that agreed to come and work here, thinking that they're coming to better their life and they're going to bring their families eventually, had to pay $3,000 for finding the job, right? A fee to get the job to this couple. And then they were brought over and they were all put in this house to live. They were, my understanding, the way he explained it, there were 4 bedrooms, like bunk beds in each room. So they had to do shifts. So 4 people slept in this room at a time and they did 3 shifts. So they kept changing people, 3 times a day. They were threatened if they spoke to immigration when they came to check on them and interview them about their visas and stuff, that they would never be able to bring their family, etc. Money was withheld, even though they lived in such area. Money was held for rent, was held for food. So they never made any of the money they were supposed to make. And plus there was a huge interest on the initial $3,000 because most of them couldn't pay the $3,000 up front. So that was kind of given to them as a loan and they had to work to pay that back. So it was a horrific case, and they actually, someone did finally speak up, and it became a very big labor trafficking case that was prosecuted here in Florida for these people. And here's a picture of living quarters. And so when this person spoke at this conference that I was at, he was an engineer. So they staffed the whole resort. So they had people who had degrees, engineering degrees. I mean, they staffed it from housekeeping all the way up. And the guy who spoke was an engineer, and he was just like, it was really very powerful when he spoke, and he was saying how he could not believe how he got trapped into this. He just couldn't believe it in the end, once he got out, how he was so trapped. And here he was, educated, college graduate, engineer, and was all caught up in this. So talking about children specifically, undocumented children and youth, and obviously there's a lot of political hype about that, and we're not going to talk about politics, but children coming in from the border, the south border near Texas and California, there's a different process if they're coming with family members or if they're coming independently. And so adults who come independently are usually sent back the past several years, but if they're with children, they're processed as a family. So it's a different process, and they're allowed to come, and they try to find family for the children to go to if they get separated. So we have a lot of children who are placed in Florida with what they call sponsors. In actuality, a lot of these sponsors who have been identified to be a relative or a friend of the families or whatever, never met the child before. The child doesn't know who they are, and they really are having the child come to force them into labor trafficking and some sex trafficking, and usually it's combined if it's a female as well. So it's been a huge problem. Those are the type of reports we've received through our hotline on minors, particularly down in Circuit 20, kids who have been placed with sponsors who the sponsor disappears, or if the child doesn't want to go to work, gets beaten, ends up, law enforcement is called by a neighbor, and the sponsor disappears again. And so we're sheltering these children because there's no caregiver available. And there's no paperwork, there's no nothing. So it's been a huge challenge to really know who the child really is, who's their family members, et cetera. So again, these kids are working 8 to 10 hours often, 7 days in fields, not going to school. It's just been a huge issue. So those are the type of cases we're seeing more with the undocumented youth. It's been more of the labor trafficking and being forced to work and not going to school. With our domestic children, we're having a lot of reports on the traveling sales crews. So these are the kids that go door to door selling items. I don't know if you've seen any of these kids with these big plastic tubs and they have like dollar store items in them selling chocolate bars or popcorn or candles. And it's usually items from a dollar store. And they usually have paperwork with them. They've been scripted what to say. They always have a really neat name like Teens Against Drugs and Alcohol or Awareness Youth Club, all of these things. And if you go on sunbiz.com, you will see that the name of that corporation or LLC or whatever they've classified themselves is true. It's legit. They make a company, they go online, they register it on Sunbiz, they pay their $75 for being a nonprofit, they print out their articles of incorporation, and that's what they flash in front of you when you ask to see what company they are. Anybody today, right now, can go online and do that. It doesn't require anything. It's a huge loophole. You don't have to have anything with IRS. You don't have to have anything else. You don't have to have liability insurance, nothing. You can just create a name of a corporation, go online, say you're a nonprofit, and print out your articles of incorporation. And so we have an issue, particularly in Central Florida. Most of the team leaders that are doing this are from the Central Florida area. They travel with these kids. They encourage them, and I want to say they do use some force, fraud, and coercion with these kids as well. What they tell the parents is one thing, what happens with the kids is something else. They are not supposed to let them go independently, but they encourage them to go out on their own so that they can make more sales. They're told that they get to keep, let's say, if they sell an item for $8, they get to keep $2 of every item they sell. But then gas is deducted, food is deducted. One time when we had a case on this and I interviewed some of the children, I'm told that they go through like to a fast food restaurant similar to McDonald's, and they're allowed to pick 2 items out of the dollar menu for their lunch, but $5 is deducted at the end of the day. It's all about profit for these leaders of these organizations that are exploiting children for their benefit. We've had cases where a child's been beaten, and when he got home, he was told to tell his mother that another child beat him, but he was actually beaten by the leader because he didn't want to work anymore. He was tired. We had a child that knocked on a door, and the lady told her that, there's a there's a registered sexual predator next door. You need to leave the neighborhood. And she calls the leader, and he tells her, oh, just cross the street and keep working. They have no concerns for the safety of the children. It's been a huge, huge problem we're having to deal with these organizations because there's a big loophole, and law enforcement is having a hard time. Even the state attorney's office is trying to figure out how to prosecute these cases. So they keep coming around. I will tell you, we have 2 types of parents. You have a set of parents that once they find out what's really happening, they don't let their child go back. And then you have a set of parents who just wants that child to come home with any amount of money, regardless how long they were out working, because they need to pay for that next hit of crack, or they need the child to pay for his own cell phone and just be out of their hair. I will tell you that the labor trafficking cases are much more related to the vulnerability of socioeconomic and financial, as opposed to the sex trafficking cases. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more. So there are federal child labor laws, right? A child under 14 may not work at all. So they used to really target kids who were 12 and 13. And so when we got involved, every time we get a report and tell them, you can't do this, the Department of Business Professional Regulations would respond with us as well. But they can only do civil penalties. They don't do criminal penalties. So they would fine these organizations for not maintaining proper employee logs, for breaking labor laws, et cetera. But all these organizations would do was just abandon that particular name of corporation and create a new name. And so all of those penalties, civil penalties, would go to collections and nothing would happen. So anyhow, under 14 may not work at all. Now they start targeting more 14 and 15-year-olds. 14 and 15 may work up to 15 hours per week when school is in session. And these kids are picked up sometimes from the parent pickup line at school and don't get home till midnight. On weekends, they work all day. They usually travel again out of county quite a bit on weekends and during summer. We have cases that have been called in from Super Bowl when it was in Atlanta. We've had cases called in from Texas on children that are from Orange County, Florida, because they were abandoned there, or and the Super Bowl in Atlanta because they like to work the tailgating parties. They really hype up the child that we're going to take you to Super Bowl. You need to make this much sales so you can go to Super Bowl. But all they get to do is do the tailgating party. They don't get tickets to go watch the Super Bowl. So one of these kids who was 14 was actually had a gun robbed at gunpoint in the bathroom at Super Bowl at the tailgating parties. And that's how we got the report on him, because he was from Orange County, no parent available. So they're really exploiting these kids for these traveling sales crews. It's a problem, and we're still trying to figure out how to put an end to it. Again, Florida labor laws are pretty similar. So for minors under 16, they can only work 8 hours a day when school is out. Again, 40 hours per week when school is out. But during a school day, only 3 hours are permitted. Again, it's the same. So these are just labor laws. Just wanted you to be aware that there are labor laws that rule what these people do, and they're being violated for laws, but nothing's really happening more than civil penalties. Now, forced criminality. Of course, there's sex trafficking, which we know what it looks like. Labor trafficking, we know what it looks like. But there's also forced criminalities. These traffickers force their victims to do other crimes. And so there's no universal definition for forced criminality, but the Anti-Slavery International describes it as a situation where a trafficked person is forced to undertake a range of criminal activities by the person or persons exploiting them. And we know that happens. We see drug selling, we see theft, we see them forcing them to steal things. There was one among minors that they would force them, there would be shoplifting, and then the youngest child of the group would go back and return it to get the cash for it. Also drug selling, also recruiting other people to become, to work in sex trafficking as well as a form of a crime. So, the coercion includes power and control by the trafficker. A lot of times, the person rather be involved in the other crimes to avoid the commercial sex part of it. And then there's threats and violence, including gang control. So I have a mentee that I've worked with since 2003, a long time. She's 30-some years old. She's a survivor. She has taught me a lot. She's a parent. She's a college graduate now. I'm so proud of that. It took her a while, but recently a college graduate, and she's doing really, really well. But this is a quote. This is one of her favorite quotes. I just want to acknowledge her when I read this quote to you. And she was forced to sell drugs. That was one of her biggest things. She worked, and it's interesting because she calls her favorite best trafficker that she ever worked for, right? Because he was relatively kind to her as opposed to the other ones who were very abusive. She sold drugs for him. This is back in early 2000s, ecstasy and other things. And she recruited girls. She was 14. But that's what she had to do. And she was grateful because she didn't have to sell her body. She just had to do that to get the benefits of living with him. She was a runaway. And so for survival, that's what she did. So this is her quote that she really loves. In situations of captivity, the perpetrator becomes the most powerful person in the life of the victim, and the psychology of the victim is shaped by the actions and beliefs of the perpetrator. So this was very powerful for her, and I just want to share that, how, they can coerce them to do other things so easily. So here's a study that shows arresting human trafficking victims for crimes their traffickers forced them to do. Individuals arrested only in relation to the trafficking are arrested 7 times more often than those arrested only for activity unrelated to their trafficking. So victims involved in trafficking are arrested 7 times more often than those who are not. And this is an adult study. Now, for youth involvement in the sex trade, a national study shows 65% of participants reported reported having a prior arrest. 16% reported a prior prostitution arrest, and 11% reported a prostitution arrest in the past year. And those with a pimp were significantly more likely to report a prostitution arrest than others. And the arrest charges, more than 4/5 were not for nonviolent crimes. Charges other than prostitution included property crimes and low-level theft, and drug-related crimes, trespassing, and loitering charges. I do want to say in Florida, I think it's since 2016, you no longer can arrest a minor for prostitution. So let's talk about the vulnerabilities. So globally, we can look at what there is globally there. So obviously political instability, war, civil unrest, political conflict, violence, right, makes people more vulnerable. Natural disasters, even the hurricanes in Florida, sometimes when there's been complete devastation. COVID has actually been a huge vulnerability. It's created more homelessness. So people may live in constant fear with limited options for survival or earning a living. That's a vulnerability. Poverty creates despair. Racism and colonialism contributed to the marginalization of people, particularly indigenous populations. And then we mentioned before LGBTQ, but gender inequality. Gender inequality is the disparity between opportunities available to men and women based on their gender. Addictions, traffickers use substance dependency and addiction to keep control of the trafficked person. Mental health, people with mental health issues face a variety of challenges, including isolation, diminished capacity to consent or offer informed consent, and limited ability to assess risk and detect ill intentions. Gangs, for gangs, the exploitation of men, women, and children is lucrative and less risky than other trades such as weapons or drugs. So the vulnerable populations to sex trafficking, the range of possibilities are refugees, unaccompanied minors, homeless children and youth, youth in foster care, urban and rural, LGBTQ youth, males and females, every race and socioeconomic class. While any child, and again, I'm talking from the perspective of the child, is at risk, commercial sex trafficking disproportionately impacts children with a history of neglect and greater social, economic, and environmental vulnerabilities. I do want to say that from those 1,600 and whatever 25 reports on unique children last year, only 20% of those reports were on children in foster care. 80% are kids out in the community, living in your neighborhoods and in schools. So even though I know you read a lot and we see a lot of research based on foster youth, because that's where the data is available, our reports show that 80% of the reports we received are on community children. And so some of the vulnerabilities, it's not necessarily, and I think I'm going to talk more about vulnerabilities. I can't see my next screen, so sometimes I get ahead of myself. But the vulnerabilities is not necessarily socioeconomic is the point I want to make. We have reports on children that are children of top executives to major corporations, Disney, other huge corporations. That become involved. And that's because they were looking for love and attention in all the wrong places. There's dysfunction in the home. It could be alcoholism. It could be substance abuse. It could be domestic violence. It doesn't have to be money related at all. And often it's not. Labor trafficking is a little bit different. It's much more money related, socioeconomic and money related. Sex trafficking is not. So vulnerable children are emotionally scared, lonely, desperate to belong, and need love. They're physically or cognitively disabilities. They have limited supports or on the run, homeless or disconnected youth. They can have low self-esteem, history of physical abuse, history of sexual abuse, runaway episodes, drug abuse, troubled and dysfunctional families. Any and all of these. Substance abuse vulnerability, sometimes there's recruitment through substance use. Traffickers may target individuals with existing substance abuse issues and keep luring them in by providing them drugs. Control through substance addiction. Traffickers may also use substance addiction to keep victims in, so they get them addicted to drugs. And substance abuse as a coping mechanism. Some victims of human trafficking may abuse substances as a response to the trauma of their trafficking. So if they weren't using before they got involved, they become a user to cope. LGBTQ vulnerability. The LGBTQ youth still face significant challenges during adolescence and early adulthood, fighting discrimination, misconceptions, and abuse by peers, family members, and others in their communities. Up to 40% of homeless youth identify as LGBTQ. 46% of sex trafficking in LGBTQ youth ran away because of family rejection. 7.4 times more likely to experience acts of sexual violence than their heterosexual peers, and 3.7 times more likely to engage in survival sex to meet basic needs such as shelter, food, drugs, and toiletries. So any questions up to now? We're going to talk about the traffickers themselves.
Sue, I just had one question.
Sure.
Have you seen that that kids that are addicted to video games have been contacted by these traffickers and kind of coerced to meet up or such? I know I went to a training on the addiction of video games, and they talked about how these kids had contacts with people all over the United States. And so I just wondered if that was a way that they...
Yeah, and I think I do have a few screens on that coming up. Again, I can't see what's ahead, but I usually do. And definitely we've seen an increase in recruitment through social media and video planning. There's different apps out there, so many apps, and I think I do have a screen on that as well. There was a really publicized case on the media there in Marion County on boys who had been recruited through Discord, which is an app. So on the video games, they play through this app. And so they're playing against people all over the country, all over the world, actually. They don't really even know who they are. Mm-hmm. Anyone can make a profile. They can say they're 15 male. They could be a 42-year-old female. They could be a 60-year-old male. It doesn't matter. But you create the profile the way you want it. And these kids are, start talking to them. And some of them that's how they get on their good side and try to fill that void, especially children who have voids in their life, and try to make them feel wanted and needed. Then they agree to meet them, and then they're gone. So we've seen a lot of that. And I'm pretty sure I have some screens coming up on that, but there has been an increase of that during COVID as well, because of all people, kids on their computers and on their video games all day. So there is recruitment and, just through all types of apps. I can't even keep up with the apps. I'm sure there's new ones being created today while we're talking right now. But yeah, definitely. It's a problem. Anything else? I'll keep going. Okay. So here we have a video of a trafficker himself. This trafficker was arrested in Toronto, Canada, and the Toronto Star interviewed him, which is a great interview. I'm only showing a small part of it. And we're going to show later his victims are going to speak out too. But he really talks about how easy it is to recruit someone. You just look for that broken person and you promise them a dream. You don't have to deliver the dream. You just promise them a dream and you have them hooked. So hopefully this plays. Yes, it's going to play.
There's a dangerous game being played in Toronto and across the country. Romeo pimps who promise love and security, then enslave girls as young as 12. Moved up and down highways, from hotel to hotel, and motel to motel. Matthew Diaco has played the game and he knows it well. Charged with trafficking, kidnapping, assault, forcible confinement. He awaits trial.
Sex is a part of life. I think a woman, if she wants to make money off it, she shouldn't have to go to jail or somebody that's helping her. It's her life, it's her body. Why should anybody be getting in trouble? Why should the Johns be getting arrested because they bought a woman? Some people don't want a relationship. They just want to get what they want and go home. No strings attached, no relation, no feelings, no fighting, no quick business deal.
How do you get a girl to fall in love with you and get a girl to be willing to do this?
It just happens. Like, most of these girls, like I said, they're broken. It's not hard. You just gotta answer their call. You get in there, you find the crack. Like, some are drugs, some are just, they need to hear I love you.
But if they just want someone to love them, this guy's not talking about loving her.
Oh, I know, but that's what she believes. It's the illusion. Be there for them. Tell them what they want to hear. And you tell them, well, we need to put money away. I'm gonna do what I do. See, I'm putting my 50 in. You have to do your 50. So there's another way you can have sex with guys. But don't worry, I'm gonna love you. You know, I'm gonna go and sell drugs if that's what I'm doing on the side, or I'm gonna be making money. I'll be here to take care of you. At the end of the night, you're home with me. Every girl's had that fantasy wedding in that house with a pink fence. You sell it to her. She'll do it.
Why will she do it?
You just sold her a dream. Some of these girls are broken. It fixes them.
What fixes them?
Knowing someone out there cares. The illusion of it, right? Me, I don't let that happen. Because I'm not gonna sit and lie to them and say, oh, I love you. I don't. I love my money.
And would you call that being a pimp?
No, I don't know what you would call it. Not a pimp, a manager.
So he was pretty guarded, but yet he really said a lot, right? So who are the traffickers, right? Perpetrators of this crime, they don't fit a stereotype. They can come from every social, ethnic, gender, and racial group. They may be involved with the local or national level gangs, larger nationwide criminal organization groups, or may have no affiliation with any one specific group. It could be a one-person organization that has one victim or has two victims working for them, or it could be a very organized. So we don't want to think of the image up here, which I just put a red X on. It's not going to be someone that you recognize by looking at them, or what's the old stereotype that you see on the media, that you see in books, etc. That is not what the reality is. There's no one single profile of a trafficker, right? It's not always organized criminals. Both men and women can be the trafficker themselves. It doesn't have to be males. It can be females. We've also had minor traffickers. We've had kids in school recruit other kids. Adult, minor, male, and female. A pimp can be a boyfriend, a business, father, mother, uncle, a coach, a teacher, or anyone exerting control over a minor or even a peer. And an adult, and a lot of times young adults. Again, I talk from the child's perspective and trainings a lot. They could be any ethnicity or race. Anyone who benefits from the commercial, sexual, or labor exploitation of another person is going to be a trafficker. So if they're benefiting from exploiting someone else, is going to be a trafficker. So they do engage in constant recruitment. You heard him talk about it. You just look for that broken person and you promise them a dream. So there's the lure, the trust, and then it's payback. And you heard him talk about that, right? The lure stage is pay special attention to the child or the adult and gives them compliments and affection. They offer romance, support, parties, drugs, and glamour, sometimes take them for their hair and nails, etc., to get done. They promise them an increased popularity. Usually they look for the person who's insecure, and they want to fill them with more securities and promise them popularity in a new peer group. And then it's that trust stage. You sell them on the glamour of the street life. You say, I love you. You have sex with the child when it's a child. You challenge the boundaries set by parents or caregivers to further separate the child from his or her family. And the same thing applies to adults too. You heard him say that you're just going to promise them a dream. And then it's time to pay back, right? He told you about he's going to do his 50%. She needs to put her 50% in. They forces the child to pay back by working and providing services. Sexual exploitation is the abuse of a position of vulnerability, differential power, or trust to profit monetarily or socially from the labor or commercial sex work of another person. So they're exploiting the person for their benefit, either through labor or sex, or sometimes both. So this is Bitterman's chart of coercion, all about power and control, coercion and control. It's very similar to domestic violence, right? There's sometimes isolation, monopolization of perception, just like he was explaining in his video there, induced stability and exhaustion when they work them extensively. They can't even argue. Occasional indulgences, demonstrating omnipotence, threats, degradation, and enforcing trivial demands. So it's a cycle that traps them in. So understanding the trafficker's tactics, right? Isolation and breaking bonds without a support system, creating fear if they leave their trafficker, using manipulation to make the victim question their capabilities and mental stability, and rotating acts of kindness with acts of violence. I'm going to go through each one separately now. So isolation and breaking bonds without a support system, taking all the victim's money and not allowing them control over their own money, while making the victim rely on the trafficker to meet their needs and wants. So even though they think they're making money, it's a great job, they don't actually get any of the money. They might get food to eat, a place to sleep, but there's complete control over them and their money. Making the victim participate in illegal activities, again, forced criminality, and then using this against them if they try to leave. Isolating the victim from their family and friends. Moving the victim to another city or state so they have no one to call or nowhere to go or ask for help. And remember, they don't have their own money or their own phones to make connections on their own. They have to do everything through the trafficker. Creating fear if they leave their trafficker. So they instill the thought that if the victim leaves or even thinks about leaving, they will not receive the money or support from their trafficker. They would be left homeless, unable to provide for themselves. It convinces the victim that they will find them wherever they go if they try to leave, and threatens to kill the victim or someone they love if they try to leave. And so this is very real. If you remember the mentee I told you that I've worked with, she had told me stories about how the trafficker, the bad trafficker, not the good trafficker, had beat the crap out of another girl that she was working with because she didn't want to work. She had her period that day. She didn't want to go out to work. So in front of the other girls, he would beat the crap out of her. So he would set an example of what would happen if they tried to pull the same stunt. So they had this fear of leaving and not doing what they were told to do. Using manipulation to make the victim question their capabilities and mental stability. Using sleep deprivation to control the victim. Playing tricks with their minds to attempt to convince the victims that they are mentally unstable. Consistently telling the victims that they are unattractive and they disgust them and no one will ever want them because of what they have done. Telling the victim that they are only good at sexual acts, so why are they trying to better themselves by going further in their education, detoxing from substances, or getting a job? And the fourth tactic, rotating acts of kindness with acts of violence. Promising to change their ways and constantly rotating acts of kindness with violence, blaming the abuse on stress or the victim's actions or behaviors, promising to love them forever, marry them, or give them a family, making the victim feel shame and self-blame for allowing this person into their life. The victim feels trapped and believes there is no way out of the abusive situation. We were talking about recruiting, so we're going to talk about online recruiting, the tactics used also there. So we're going to play this. And this thing is up. I guess I'm going to have to go in here and do it. I'm going to have to stop sharing and reshare once I bring it up.
I hope that life won't pass me by, the light inside of me. The walls get taller, I feel smaller, trying hard to breathe. I wish that I could erase time, remember all my dreams. I wonder what it is that lies behind all of your teeth.
Okay, so that video is really good at showing how blind the parents can be. You need to be paying attention to what's going on in your child's life. Whoops, let me get back to the right one. Okay, we should be back on track now. So online danger. This is in statistics. So before 2004, only 38% of victims met their traffickers online. After 2004, 75% of victims that met their traffickers online. And in 2018, 90% of victims that met their traffickers online. Here it shows you a little better. So the access and ability to connect more vulnerable youth online is huge, right? So if you're online, you have access to so many more victims as opposed to in person. So we do know that it's really increased. It's an increased risk just having children having smartphones and being online and computers and tablets and playing with their video games. So there's so many social media recruitment apps. Like I said, I can't even list them all, but we've had cases on all of these. Bumble, Zeus, Monkey, Scout, Badoo, Kick, Whisper, Hot or Not, Calculator. There was a lot of media on Calculator when it first came out because it looks like a calculator on the child's smartphone, but once you open up and go behind it, it's an actual chatting group and pictures. Grindr is known more among the LGBTQ community. Snapchat, TikTok. TikTok is very popular right now, but it's also causing us a lot of issues in the child welfare world as well. Microspace, Plenty of Fish, there's so many, and there's more that are being created every day. There's also sextortion, which leads to trafficking. And sextortion refers to the broad category of sexual exploitation in which power or blackmail is the means of coercion and can be coupled with the threatened release of sexual images or information. So we've had cases where like a child in high school who's had really low self-esteem and unpopular, and all of a sudden someone who's very popular befriends her and wants to take her to a party. And she goes to a party and then she's gang raped and it's all videotaped. And then if she doesn't come back and do what they tell her to do, they're going to release that to everyone. So that's kind of sextortion. And then of course, once they bring her back and make her start prostituting, and then it becomes sex trafficking. So the purpose is to acquire additional, increasingly more explicit sexual content. They, requests, like you saw in the video there, the girls sending videos and pictures online. And then sometimes they try to obtain money from the youth as well, or to meet them and have sex with the youth. So, sextortion is also huge during COVID as well. It's always existed, but we're seeing more of it. Keeping children safe on social media. Can't present all of that and not just say how we can keep them safe. Educate yourself and stay up to date with the new apps. Every few weeks, do a quick online search for new social media apps. Get familiar with the apps before your kids do. Check the kids' devices frequently and thoroughly. View the child's activities, messages, contacts. Set appropriate parental controls, age restrictions for downloading apps, and time restrictions. Discuss the apps, sites you find with your kids. Ask them for what they know and keep the lines of communication open. Educate your children on the dangers of oversharing online. Remind them that social media is not a diary or a personal photo album. But most importantly, and this is what we stress mostly, maintain a connected relationship with your kids. Rely more on your grandkids. Rely more on your relationships with them than filters and other safeguards, because they learn how to bystep those eventually. So who's buying children? Let's talk about the demand a little bit. Buyers can be anyone. They're all genders, races, socioeconomic status, and professions. Buyers of minors for sexual purposes often have difficulty interacting with their adult peers. Buyers are willing to treat other people like objects or commodities that they can buy and exploit for their own sexual benefit. And buyers that pay or solicit for sexual acts or pornography of a person under the age of 18 can be charged with human trafficking per Florida state and federal laws. They will also be verified as a human trafficking perpetrator by DCF. So we know that, unfortunately, family, friends, organized crime, cartels and gangs, exotic dance club patrons, opportunists, first responders have been arrested for this. Firefighters have been arrested for this. Business leaders, faith leaders, wealthy population, low income population. So it's really comes from anywhere. But we know that buyers are usually seeking to buy because they want power and control over the victim, right? Because a lot of them have wives or permanent partners or girlfriends or boyfriends or in relationships, but they still go out and seek to buy and pay for something because they feel like they have power and control. And that's when we find the child tied up with the hotel phone wire or whatever it might be. There's just so much fetishes and different things that go on it's just crazy. So we have them listed under 3 types. You have the pedophile, who's an adult who over a period of at least 6 months has recurrent intense sexual urges and sexually arousing fantasies involving sexual activity with a prepubescent child or children, generally age 13 or younger. Then there's situational abusers, adults who use children for sex, not because they have a predisposition to do so, but just because they want to find themselves in a situation where it's possible. Then you have the I can't even pronounce this, ephophilia and hipophilia, adult who has a stronger exclusive attraction to post-pubescent child adolescents. So it's all different, but it's basically because they want the power and control of paying for it. So how does this trauma impact our victims? Any questions before I go on with that?
Not seeing any hands, Sue.
Okay. So the impact of trauma on trafficking victims, there's obviously a physical impact, spiritual impact, social impact, emotional impact, and psychological impact. And it's a cycle. It just keeps going, they all affect each other. Physical, it could be continued physical abuse, rape, STDs, sexual transmitted diseases, loss of bowel control, sometimes pregnancy wanted, not wanted, a lot of dental issues. A lot of times their teeth are knocked out if it's not from drug use, facial dental reconstruction, tattoos and branding. Traffickers like to brand, and I don't like using the word product, but that's how they consider them. That's how they treat them, like they're a product. And often they tattoo them. And it's not to say everyone who has a tattoo would be a victim. No, a lot of people have tattoos, but that tattoo has a meaning to that person when they go get the tattoo. when you ask them about the tattoo, they're happy to explain what it means to them. But particularly with kids, because I've interviewed a lot of kids, if you ask them, they avoid answering. Sometimes, again, a child's not supposed to be able to get a formal tattoo without a parent permission. Yet you have these girls go run away and come back, and they have all these expensive tattoos. And you ask them about them, and it's the way they respond to you that you know something's going on. But there is tattoo and branding, substance abuse addiction, brain damage, etc. Self-cutting. We all know sexual abuse has to do with self-cutting as well. Spiritual impact: despair, hopelessness, lack of belief in humanity, lack of faith in the spiritual power, which is interesting because going back to my mentee, when she was out running the streets, she had, she would say that she didn't, believe in God, that she didn't have any, it was like a hopelessness about it all. Where were they when she needed them? But when she became a survivor, it completely reversed. And she's very religious now, and she thinks that's the only strength that got her out of the life. So it's interesting how that flipped, but it's their mindset at the time and how they're really kind of warped from the traffickers' perspective. Social impact, they're isolated from peers, disconnected from their community. A lot of them are not going to school, not getting education, wouldn't have any type of training to get a job on their own. Life skills, they don't have money, know how to balance checkbooks, none of that, because everything's being handled by the trafficker and they're just being victimized. Emotional impact, you can imagine what that is, and psychological impact. So it's a cycle at all. One affects the other as well. Trauma bonding. So all this trauma with the trafficker creates a trauma bonding. And bonding is a biological occurrence related to emotions that make people more important to each other and is influenced by time spent together. And traumatic bonding occurs as a result of ongoing cycles of abuse, which the intermittent reinforcement of reward and punishment creates powerful emotional bonds that are resistant to change. And traumatic bonding can be defined as misuse of fear, excitement, sexual feelings, and sexual physiology to entangle another person. A strong emotional attachment between an abused person and his or her abuser formed as a result of this cycle of violence. Traumatic experiences triggers the person into survival mode. This triggers the primal fight, flight, or freeze responses in which the freeze response is engaged. Trauma bonding becomes wired in the brain to repeat activities that cause a feeling of reward. When the person is engaged in an abusive relationship, sometimes as simple as a moment of kindness can seem like such a reward. And this will cause their brain to produce a surge of dopamine, which could also encourage the victim to become more attached to their abuser. So it's all about the trauma bonding. So if you remember, we saw Matthew Diego talk about how easy it was to just promise them a dream and to recruit them into the life of trafficking. Now we're going to hear from some of the victims. And they're going to talk about how they were bonded.
Most of these girls, like I said, they're broken. It's not hard. You just got to answer their call. You get in there, you find the crack. They just want anyone to love them. It's the illusion. Be there for them. Tell them what they want to hear. Every girl's had that fantasy wedding in that house with a pink fence. You sell it to her. I'm going to be making money. I'll be here to take care of you. At the end of the night, you're home with me. She'll do it.
Why will she do it?
You just sold her a dream.
He burned me. He burned me one time.
With what?
This fucking cigarette. Choked me. Freaking passed right out. Choked me like Bart Simpson. I think it is like an out-of-body experience. Like you just block yourself off, like you're numb, you can't think, you can't hear nothing. And then when it's done, it's done. Like, just do it as fast as you can and kick them out.
Before this happened, I was just an ordinary girl, just graduated high school. I was just looking for love and attention, and I just wanted to feel like I fit in, because everyone wants to feel like they fit in. I became friends with a girl that I was working with at a bar. She just introduced me to the world. So it was easy to feel like I wasn't being used, even though I knew something was wrong. From that point, I just felt trapped in her control.
There were two men. I actually had promised that I wouldn't have to do anything I didn't want to do. Made me feel special, loved, cared for, important.
You're trained like a robot from these guys. All you know is work, money, eat, sleep. Work, money, eat, sleep. You have to be where they say. You have to listen to them like you're their slave.
They were in control of everything.
What I wore, what I ate.
When I slept and how long I slept for.
When I showered, when I went to bed, when I woke up.
What I ate, when I ate.
How much money I could keep on me, nail color, everything.
Sometimes I just work all around the clock. I wouldn't sleep. If you try to run, they'll come after you and do stuff, like come to your family. And that's all you know, like you're so scared, you get PTSD and you just can't get out of it.
I was seeing people day and night.
I'd get drunk, I'd get high, because I don't want to think about it, and it just made it easier.
Even though I physically could have left, I honestly felt like they had a hold on me from the inside, from my mind.
I told myself that this was it, and I just have to accept it, that I'm never gonna have a normal life.
They had completely controlled my state of mind, which in turn controlled whether I stayed or went, which there was no option.
He made me like compete with other girls, and so I'd get jealous and I'd be like, I'm gonna make more money than her, so he hangs around with me more. I was in love with him, and I have his name on my body. So it's like you're their property, you can't run away.
I feel like I was afraid of the shame, the judgments, because a lot of people think that I could have just walked away, and so I feel like people just think that I was there because I wanted to.
They would say things to make me feel good about myself, and then they would say things to really belittle me and make me feel like I was just damaged goods. There was no choice, even though there was a choice.
I feel like I see the world differently. I looked at people through rose-colored glasses before, and now I see it has changed me. I do not trust men. I don't think I ever will trust a man.
Okay. So you all that kind of should have come together in that video. You heard them talk about it. But CSEC victims form trauma bonds with their perpetrators because the violence and threats of violence, alternating violence and kindness increases the bonding. Believing if they think a disloyal thought, exploiters will know and retaliate. The isolation increases the bonding. And shame and stigma associated with prostitution, rape, losing virginity also increases that bonding.
Sue?
Yes.
I just have a question. When
Sure.
you work with this a lot, what kind of an effect does that have on you? It's kind of depressing. I'm sitting here thinking, oh.
Yeah. Well, I will say that I'm a little bit more removed than I used to be. So, many years ago, actually, in 2003, so we're talking, I'm old. I should be retired like you guys. So in 2003, I was really in charge of the missing children from foster care. So back in 2003, we were not recognizing or talking about human trafficking or sex trafficking or child prostitution, right? And I don't know if I have a slide coming up, but about the terminology we use, because back in the day, I think all of us are old enough to know that when we thought of child prostitute, what came to mind was a child making the wrong choices, dysfunctional family, substance abuse, kind of like, someone on the other side of the tracks. We didn't at all think about the victimization as much as we should have, like we do today. We learned over the years, right? Commercial sexual exploitation of a child, the term instead of child prostitute just reads out victimization, right? So we recognize that it's not a choice that the child's made in its victimization. But getting back to my story, back in 2003, I was searching for all the missing children from foster care. And I was seeing it everywhere, right? We were picking up kids from Las Vegas, from California, from Miami during prostitution stings. All these kids were very much involved. And back then, when I was much more on the front lines, it was hard. I mean, I would go to bed and not sleep. I would be honest with you and think, okay, did we do the right thing? Did I check if this child is here? Did I call so and so? Because I knew, almost one child a year was ending up dead. From my kids, missing children, statistics showed, and I had experienced it, we were finding one of them dead a year. And it was related to all the ones that ended up dead was related to trafficking usually. Sometimes it was a substance abuse overdose, but it's all indirectly related because they had to survive when they were out in the streets, or they went back to family that they were removed from because the family already had so much dysfunction going on. But I kind of had to learn how to compartmentalize. And, I have 4 children myself. I have 6 grandchildren at this point. But to compartmentalize it all and to think if, when you help one person, that one person that says thank you, and, out of every 20 or 50 or whatever, it's rewarding enough to keep you going. I mean, so that's how I always went to, if I'm going to help one, if I'm going to get one to leave the life or get, get one child to stop running away or help one child when I used to be a child abuse investigator, it's, because it's a revolving door with these kids. And we're going to talk about that at the very end. We can identify them, we can connect them to services and with the adults as well. But if they don't want the services, or they're not ready, they're not at that contemplation of change, it's just a revolving door and they go right back to it. And you put all that energy into it to get there. So it's just really, I think, compartmentalizing and now I'm more on the quality assurance side as opposed to the actual on the streets with them. So I'm less, I can just detach myself a lot easier than I used to be able to.
Okay,
But
thank you.
You're always thinking about it.
When you get to a place where you want more questions, I see another one in the chat. So.
Okay. See, where were we? We're talking about the trauma bonding, right? So they show ongoing symptoms of trauma bonding and PTSD, like the girl said in the video, intensely grateful for small kindness, denies violence when violence and threats of violence are actually occurring, rationalizes violence, denies anger, exploiter to others and to self, believe they have some control over the abuse, believe if they control their situation, it lessens the pimps and customers' traffic's control and abuse. And they self-blame themselves for the situation and abuse, because I think that's a coping mechanism. Most of especially the kids anyhow, that we are involved with, they never disclose, they never admit, they never cry out for help because they don't want to admit that they put themselves in that situation or that they are in that situation. They want to say that they're in charge of what's going on, and that's their coping mechanism. They're hypervigilant to the exploiter's needs. They seek to keep the exploiter happy. They try to get inside the trafficker's or customer's head. They see the world from the exploiter's perspective. They may or may not have their own perspective any longer. They experience sense of self through the trafficker and pimps and customers' eyes. They see outside authorities, people trying to win release and escape as bad guys. They see the exploiter as a good guy and protector. And they see the exploiter as a victim. And they're thankful and grateful that the trafficker or customer have not killed them because they have probably witnessed that before. So we know that the trauma bonding is a Stockholm syndrome, and I'm sure all of you know where Stockholm syndrome came from. But it occurs when a person feels a presence of a perceived threat to one's physical or psychological survival and the belief that the abuser would carry out the threat, the presence of a perceived small kindness from the abuser to the victim, isolation from perspectives other than that of the abuser, and the perceived inability to escape the situation. And we know that Stockholm syndrome affects abused children, battered and abused women, prisoners of war, cult members, incest victims, criminal hostage situations, which is where the term came from, the bank robbery in Sweden, concentration camp prisoners, controlling intimidated relations, but we've added recently over the recent years, trafficking victims definitely are suffering from Stockholm syndrome. So identifying victims. For child trafficking indicators, and you see up here the tattoos on the arms, Savage is a trafficker that was in Palm Bay. This is a child that was recovered. You see the $ and stars are pretty common with making money, trafficking. And again, on the other child, Successful is also a name of a trafficker, a street name. These are street names for traffickers. Again, you see the $, you see the star and the diamond. We didn't really talk about the different terminology used among trafficking victims and traffickers, but the star and the diamond is like the leader of the group, the one who makes the most money. And that's where those symbols come from as well. So evidence of controlling or dominating relationships. This is for child trafficking indicators. Secrecy of whereabouts, they keep unusual hours, fearful, anxious, or submissive behavior, suspicious tattoos or other signs of branding, unexplained absences or regular attendance, signs of malnutrition or chronic fatigue, lacks control of ID or money, history of running away, and more importantly, presence of gifts whose origin is unknown, or other signs of grooming, like someone, they've gone and come back with their hair and nails done. They had no independent means to pay for that themselves, or coming back with a new phone or a computer, etc. Gifts that they could not afford on their own, or, the family members has not paid for them should be a red flag as well. So for general human trafficking, labor and sex trafficking, and for all and adults, living with an employer, poor living conditions. Remember the Philippines group of people that came from the Philippines. Multiple people in cramped space, inability to speak to individuals alone. Their answers appear to be scripted and rehearsed. Employers holding identity documents, signs of physical abuse, submissive or fearful, unpaid or paid very little, and if they're under 18 and involved in prostitution, then they are a victim. So response. I think we're staying on time here, which is great. So for DCF, we have an organized response, like I said, and I think for adults and other agencies as well, we can identify, we can assess the needs of the victim, we can develop a plan to meet the needs, we can link them to the services, and we can monitor, do case management to make sure it's all happening the way it's supposed to be happening. That's the easy part. That we know how to do. The problem is there's challenges with that, right? There's always immediate needs, and sometimes you can't financially find them, or in your location you don't find them, particularly with adults. Children's a different story because at DCF we have to handle that and meet their immediate needs of safety, crisis intervention, medical care, mental health, personal items, clothing, food, detox, and shelter are considered all immediate needs. When you come across an adult victim and they don't have Medicaid and they don't have insurance, you're going to have to find pro bono medical care for them. You're going to have to find pro bono mental health. It's good if you're a service provider for them, you have personal items in your office to help give them, a clean shirt to put on, a clean, socks, a jacket if they need a jacket, something to go wash their face, sometimes shampoo, because if they're coming right off the street, they're coming without anything. So we can identify, we can assess their needs, but then sometimes they're unwilling to disclose or to even engage in services. They don't want to participate, especially if non-documented, they're scared. They think anything connected to anything legal or law enforcement or anything like that could be a problem. And other ones aren't ready to commit or engage. There's ongoing risk of exploitation and harm. There's no financial support or other income. So we meet these immediate needs, and what's long-term, what's going to be next week? How long can we pay for that hotel when they're adults?
To ensure that you have reviewed the message. So whenever you've seen a message here and you've read it, check the green button.
Instability, lack of accommodation, legal, criminal, immigration issues. They could have been arrested for something. They could be non-documented. They have immigration issues. They could have been, forced criminality, et cetera. So there might be issues there. And lack of services. So once you've met the immediate needs, then, continuity of care. Do you have services to provide for that? So I think we're still working on all of that. Not all areas of the state of Florida have a continuity of care in place. And then sometimes, especially adults, they don't want to move. They don't want to go to a different area. They want to be around family. Some of them have kids who parents are taking care of, et cetera. So there are challenges. It looks a lot, this looks great and we can do all this, but it's just easier said than done, right? So I don't want to make it sound like, oh yeah, perfect. No, it's not. So just some trauma-informed screening tips. You want to always ask for permission. I don't know if any of you would ever be working with the victims, but you want to ask for permission. You want to meet them where they are at in terms of their understanding of their current circumstances. A lot of times we have our own agenda, what we want to provide them and where we want to see them go, and the continuity of care and services, but that's not what they want or what they think their needs are. So we have to respect that. Avoid victim blaming attitudes, body language, or behaviors. Avoid gas and acting shocked. So when you're first, building rapport and having trust is the only way you're going to get anywhere with the victim. And until they feel like they can trust you, they're not going to connect or talk to you or even accept anything you're trying to provide them. So it's tricky at the beginning. You want to make sure you're non-judgmental. You want to avoid pity and patronization. You want to always assess the safety and threat levels. You want to be flexible, but be upfront. And you want to anticipate and expect that the victim may return to their trafficker. I don't know what the statistics is. I haven't seen anything ever printed on that, but we know with DV, it used to be 8 times, right? They leave the abuser 8 times, return 8 times before they finally leave. And I'm sure trafficking is going to be at least similar, even more times. I just want to give an example, avoid gas and acting shocked. It's really hard to do. If you've not talked a lot to victims, and you're always going to hear something new, even if you've talked to them 100 times. But going back to my mentee, I just want to share this. When she was about, I want to say 20, I started sitting down and talking to her because I wanted to create trainings like this. And I wanted to learn from her and know what our caseworkers should know, what made her disrupt every placement, et cetera. And one thing I remember asking her, and it was really hard for me to keep a straight face. Now I can say anything to her and, it's fine because we have that close connection. But this was way back. And I was saying, well, when you would, at midnight decide to run away from the youth shelter, right? And you were 13, what made you feel safe to be on the roads, on the streets at night? And she goes, oh, I kept a double-edged razor blade under my tongue. Until today, I cannot imagine anyone keeping a single-edged razor blade under their tongue. Forget a double-edged razor blade under their tongue. But she said that like without a beat, and I had to be careful because at the time I was just trying to build rapport with her and to learn more from her. And if I had made a face and said, "Oh my gosh," anything like that, then she would have probably stopped talking to me at that point. But then I had to say, "Oh, tell me, did you ever have to use it?" And we went on from that. And her story is that she learned all these things from her mother. Her mother was a prostitute and her father was a trafficker. She didn't know that until after she, got older, but she learned all of that. And she used to go out on the streets with her mom as a young child, and she saw that and knew how to do that. So treatments are borrowed from evidence-based interventions initially developed for PTSD. So there is no evidence-based treatment specific for human trafficking. It's two relatively newly identified or as human trafficking. But they have borrowed evidence-based interventions developed for PTSD, domestic violence, sexual abuse, and captivity. So they use trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectical trauma-focused cognitive behavior therapy. EDMR is relatively new. It's being tried, but they're having success with human trafficking survivors. And we know that participating in group counseling can empower survivors of sex trafficking and provide them with an opportunity to share their experiences, generating a sense of community and support. And that's from a research done by Hopper in 2018. So I don't really have a lot to tell you about the treatment modalities. Again, it's overall general response, providing continuum of care for them. And then the whole clinical side, we connect them with, the clinical piece. They have to be ready. That's the biggest problem that we have. But these are the type of therapies that have been popularly used and been successful. Of course, if you suspect human trafficking, if it's for a minor, you call the DCF abuse hotline. If it's something that needs an emergency response, you would always call your local law enforcement. If you see something right then and there, you want someone to respond. But if you just want to report it, you're suspicious of something, you can call for adults, the National Human Trafficking Hotline, which is the Polaris report, which is right there, 1-888-373-7888, or the Florida Abuse Hotline for minors. For the internet crime, suspicion on internet and online gaming, etc., you can make a complaint to the FBI. You can also make a report to the cyber tip line at NCMEC, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, if it's particularly on children. And then, of course, for agriculture work, there's that other hotline down at the bottom. But always call 911 for emergency situations, your local authorities and police. And I think I'm done. Did I finish in time? What time is it? Oh, so let me see. If you need my information, it's there. And I'm going to stop sharing so I can answer any questions, see faces and answer any questions. I know I just talked a lot. So any questions?
There's a question in chat from Bonnie. Bonnie, do you want to ask this question? Or do you want me to ask it for you? She says, do you think legalizing sex workers would be one solution?
You know that they tried that in Sweden, and there was a research project done that I've read on it, and it didn't really, it just moved it and it made it go down to minor. So if you legalize, you would never legalize for children, right? It would be just for adults. So what happens, and the children become more victimized, is what happened in that report. So I don't, I'm not going to say yes or no. I just don't think so because of that.
I just had a kind of a comment. A million things were going through my head as you were talking. I was trying to decide which thing to say, but a couple things. First off, I used to supervise sex offenders. And I remember supervising one sex offender who used to get mail order brides. And so we never really considered the human trafficking aspect. It was more that he was a sex offender and he would get these underage girls and send for them. And so I thought that, would have given us a whole different perspective, I think, when we were supervising them.
Yeah, I think if we go back and look now, what we know now, I mean, I even know with my even child abuse investigations days, like I said, we weren't looking at human trafficking as a maltreatment. So many of those sexual abuse cases I received and some of those young kids, I can just go back and I can see it everywhere now.
And then the other thing is when I did supervise them, then I became a field supervisor. I supervised a unit of sex offender agents, and we had to place them in the community when they were released from prison. And we would have loved a place like the Villages because we had more trouble trying to find where to put these people to keep them away from daycare centers and schools. I mean, it was an impossible task. And I went and did this map thing in our area, and I see that I have over 5 sex offenders within 1 mile of my house here. And so it just makes me know that we have a lot of them here, and that the possibility of maybe us getting having a referral of somebody for counseling, we may, come into contact with people like that.
Right. Sure.
So.
Yeah.
Well, anyone else before we close? We'd like to thank you so much, Sue, for being here with us.
You're welcome.
And doing this and covering all this material. It's so much I have not heard of before, and it was very quite interesting. I'd like to share one slide here just to tell you this is sponsored by TLC Services. And we are a group of about 25 volunteer mental health professionals. And we do training, support groups, presentations, and one-on-one counseling. Our presentations include this type of CEU training. And we have a great website with videos of past presentations if you'd like to take a look.